infection rates are after these types of events happen where people are more likely to be together. And that's really in hubs like train stations or airports. So we're going to have to wait and see to see if any super spreader type events are going to actually come out of this holiday period. And that's going to be really important going into Christmas as well. It'll give us some indication as to really what practices are safer, and should really be avoided.
Yeah, so, Doctor, I have a family member who flies for Delta, and he was explaining to me that their flights were packed up to the 60% threshold during this. And, there's a lot of people who are saying that the travel, like you just said, could be airports, train stations, things like that. But on airplanes, they have HEPA filters that are cycled through 50 times in a minute or hour or whatever it is. Is this really a danger, though, as travel and things like that? Because a lot of people, like myself, we had family Thanksgiving. We had 5, 8 people at a time, but instead of one giant one with 30 people, I had 4 or 5 with 5 to 8 people. So is there really any difference, or is just kind of business as usual in smaller groups?
Yeah, so we have to remember there's always going to be a risk, right? We're not a nanny state, and we can't promise to protect people across all the risks that they face in their day-to-day decision-making and daily lives. So that being said, there's guidelines for a reason. The reason we have these limitations, the reason that there are these suggestions of how to protect yourselves and your loved ones, is so that people can then use their common sense and put into place what makes the most sense for them, while still respecting that they're part of a society and need to protect others, especially those most vulnerable. So the advice is, as you're more vulnerable, remove yourself from those situations, but then everybody else act and behave in a way that is societally amenable.
Yeah, I always say, look, be respectful and stuff like that. I'm not a big mask guy. I don't think they're particularly effective on a mandate spectrum. However, there is this danger in the talk of the COVID vaccines. Also, we've talked about, you and I before, about COVID fatigue. And are people going to get a false sense of security when this vaccine, actually the delivery of it, could be months away?
So I do worry about that. But what's really exciting about these vaccines is that they're coming out sooner than we even expected when we first started reporting on them. Francis Collins, the head of NIH, said that he hoped a vaccine would make it through emergency approval through the FDA by the end of December. Well, actually, it's looking like Pfizer is already seeking emergency approval, so we should have that through in the next 2 to 3 weeks, which means take Operation Warp Speed into account, we could have potentially herd immunity up to 70% of Americans by spring of next year. The false sense of security comes from if people don't take the vaccine. And as much as science is constantly moving, it's not static, which is why there's been so much information that's evolved and changed since this virus broke, right? We know that. We've been reporting on it. And sometimes it seems like day to day, some of the guidelines and advice is changing. I understand how that can create confusion. But one thing is settled. Vaccines work. And especially the amount of ingenuity and resources and expertise that went into developing these 3, and now Johnson & Johnson has one in the pipeline as well. It is absolutely worth getting vaccinated when the option becomes available, so that we can have that immunoresponse to the spike protein of the coronavirus, which we know will give us that herd immunity protection so we can get back to normal life. These two things don't coexist, bro. We can't get back to normal life and be against vaccines. We have to together as a community, respect the ingenuity that went in behind getting these vaccines to the public and take them when they become available.
Yeah, and Doctor, I don't want to seem like an anti-vaxxer, because I'm not. I think that they have their place in society. However, my concern and why I'm not going to get it immediately is because this was gone through very quickly, and while it may have been thoroughly reviewed and everything like that, you have no long-term studies on the efficacy of this thing and what it could do to you long-term. But there is evidence to show that, like, some people exposed to it have T-cell buildup and immunities and self-immunities and things like that. Are you going to get this vaccine as soon as possible?
I absolutely will. And the reason for that is there is always a risk when we're putting out new innovations, whether they're drugs or whether they're technologies. There's always going to be a risk, but you have to do that cost-benefit analysis and realize that this is a better outcome for yourself and everyone that you interact with, to protect yourself against a worse outcome, which is having an adverse reaction to the coronavirus, right? So we're always weighing out against two evils in that sense. I have done decades of research on chemical molecular entities. It's all up in a book that I have out as well, looking at pharmaceutical drug safety. even if a drug is put forward, we're perceiving it coming out quickly, but it has to still meet that
Right.
safety standard. It's not going to get through the FDA otherwise. No way. And then we have this incredibly robust, what we call pharmacovigilance system, where if anything happens, once it's out into the public, the FDA will hear about it and then go back and look at that drug, look at whether or not there's more adverse events associated with it.
Yeah.
So we have a really robust regulation system in place in this country that we should be proud of and we should trust.
Well,
So,
I think it's very good that you said that you were going to jump into it, because we have a lot of people who's come on this program and other programs that are like, we all need to go out and get it, and then you ask, are you going to get it? And they're like, well, So it is actually reassuring for a lot of people. Personally, I'm still going to wait it out. I'm not against it, but I'm going to wait to see how it comes out once they've tested on 20, 30, 40, 50 million people and see what that is. One of the big things, though, which is very important, which I think not enough people are talking about, is since these trials began for this vaccine, how have trials for other diseases like cancer and other things that are affecting people in high death rates outside of COVID, how have those been affected negatively?
Yeah, that's a great point, right? We don't always look at the secondary and tertiary ripple effects of something like a COVID shutting down society, and not just the implications for public health capacity, but what does that mean for other public health disease states and outcomes that would have been managed and are experiencing now negative hits, right? So an example of this, a positive potentially, is the reduction in elective surgeries. Maybe people are deferring doing surgeries that never really were necessary in the first place, and we're getting better outcomes for those patients because of that.
Mm-hmm.
But in the same vein, there's some critical trials that we really rely on for those breakthroughs, like in cancer,
right,
in cardiovascular disease. And we're seeing, unfortunately, a 10% decrease month to month in these treatment clinical trials
mm-hmm,
for these more rare disease states. And so that's really unfortunate, because that's really where American innovation and breakthrough comes from, and we can't afford to see a decrease there.
Right, and I think that's the other thing, is there's only so much medical bandwidth in America right now for our fields.
Exactly.
So we're seeing, sure, they've done record things with this coronavirus. They've gotten it through. They've gotten amazing clinical trials, and they've done a really good job. They've done a ton of money into it, but now we're seeing things like the cancer, like you just talked about, but also depression, suicides. We're seeing a lot of adverse effects to this isolationism that we've kind of been forced upon ourselves. Some of it's self-imposed, but some of it is forced upon us to desocialize. And one of my biggest concerns is, as we head into the Christmas season, how is that going to affect the way we do business as shopping, the way we hold family gatherings, the way we hold mass services, which is a big thing. A lot of people are very content they will go to church on Sunday, on Christmas Day. And how is that going to affect us in the Christmas season?
Yeah, and this is a real concern. Again, we don't, unfortunately, combine mental and physical health in the way we should. And your brain and your gut are connected, your physical well-being and is really reliant on your social interactions. And loneliness is increasingly being documented as a very serious threat, not just to your mental health, but it has physical manifestations. It's a risk factor to a lot of other chronic diseases. And so this is something we need to take a holistic look and approach towards, especially going into these seasons where there are, anyway, outside of COVID, heightened sense of risk. So there's increased loneliness, there's increased depression, there's increased mental health, negative outcomes, and top that with coronavirus. This is a time that we really need to be even more aware of what our fellow neighbors and extended family members that we wouldn't normally interact with, except for outside of these seasons, are going through, and be there for one another. Because I absolutely agree with you, these are the impacts that aren't talked about nearly as much as they need to be, but are really contributing to overall negative outcomes for American mental, physical health, and society at all, right? We're all in this together, and we need to make sure we look at the big picture.
Yeah, my biggest concern has always been, is the cure or treatment or procedure worse than the actual disease itself? Dr. Shuta Chakraborty, thank you very much for your insight this morning.
Thanks a lot.
All right, coming up, Republicans may be dejected